Hello, everybody. I'm Robert Barton. I'm here at North Carolina State University and will be the host for today's webinar. I'll be handling the logistics, and then I'll get us kicked off here, and then we'll turn it over to the presenters and everything. So just real quick, copies of the presentations today are available on the site in which you joined the webinar. You can scroll down below. You'll be able to, I'll post that link here in the chat in a minute. You can always get back to the presentation slides that way. We'll be taking questions today in the webinar. We ask that you use the Q&A feature of Zoom. Just click on the icon and you'll be able to type in your questions. We will be answering those after the presentations today. And with that, I'm going to turn the topic over to Bruno Silva with the University of Georgia. Bruno.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the current research in hurricane disturbed forests. We are excited to have everyone here participating in this series of talks. My name is Bruno Silva. I'm assistant professor at the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. Our goal here is to inform our initial results in research on the hurricanes. This seminar is possible thankful for a grant, a joint venture with the with the Forest Service in a grant called Hurricane Salvage and Supply Chain, Welfare and Carbon Outcome. Today is the first day of this series of talk. We are going to have 4 presenters, Christine Fortuyn from the Mississippi State University, also assistant professor there, myself, Adam Polinko from the Mississippi State University, assistant professor specializing in silviculture, and Robert Chastain, which is a researcher at Red Castle Resources. I would like to know, just for testing the webinar chat, if you guys could just write, where you're from. I think Norman Patson just did that. Where you're from, and your name and where you're from. That'll be fine. And then we're gonna jump into our first talk, which will be Christine Fortuyn. Okay, yeah, we have people from Miami, Arizona. Oh yeah, across Colorado. That's good. Across all over. Okay, that's great. We are very excited to have you guys here. Christine, please, the floor is yours. She's going to present on modeling wind disturbance in forest habitats.
Excellent. Welcome, everybody.
Christine, sorry to interrupt, but what we're seeing is the wrong screen.
Okay, let me try that again. Here we go. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. So welcome, everybody. I am going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've been working in. A lot of what I'm going to present is research that I did while I was at University of Georgia as a postdoc. I'll also touch on some of the current projects that are upcoming that we're working on here out of Mississippi State. So I'll just dive right in here. If my slide will advance, there we go. So the primary goals, as I see it, of this research are to develop prediction models of forest damage. And I'm interested in both hurricanes and tornadoes. So I'm going to present a little bit of both in this presentation. And I'm also interested in understanding how biotic communities respond to wind disturbance. So I operate at multiple scales. So the idea of that is that we look at the landscape scale as well as the stand scale and also the community scale, with the idea that management for resilient systems will be at the intersection of the 3 scales. So I'm going to start with some of the work I've done at the landscape scale. So I started with tornadoes, and part of the reason that I started with tornadoes is because there is a data set available from NOAA on tornado damage going back to 2012. So this is data that they collect after severe thunderstorms and tornado events, where they're either on the ground or using satellite imagery to determine the levels of damage, and this helps them to determine the F scale for the tornado or severe event. So they have this data published. They take data on tree damage as well as on infrastructural damage. So what we were able to do was extract all of the damage records of trees for tornadoes that was captured by NOAA going back to 2012. It's not, excuse me, it's not a perfect data set. The finest resolution that they go to in terms of tree species is just hardwood versus pine. So that's the only, level of resolution that we're able to work with this data set. But they log whether it's a pine or a hardwood damage, and then they log the degree of damage from a scale of 1 to 5. So what that looks like is their category 1 and 2 damage are when small limbs are broken. Small diameter limbs, category 1 up to 1 inch diameter, category 2 1 to 3 inch diameter. So it sort of looks like what's in the picture here. Their category 3 damage is when trees are uprooted, and 4 is when trunks are snapped. And then there's another category. This is an odd one, and there's actually very few points in the database that actually have this category. It's when trees are debarked with only the stubs of largest branches remaining. So what we did for our analysis is that we grouped categories 1 and 2 together, and we call this a low level of damage. Category 3 is uprooting, or the second category is uprooting, and then we group category 4 and 5 together into what we call breakage. So we have these 3 levels of damage that we're looking at and trying to determine what variables will influence the different levels of damage. So we did that by bringing in several different data sets, including terrain, climatic, and soil variables. So terrain, we're looking at things like elevation, slope, aspect, terrain ruggedness index. We use a digital elevation model to get those data. For climate, we're looking at temperature, precipitation, average wind speeds, etc. And then for soil, we're looking at things like bulk density, pH, bedrock depth, and permeability. And what we did was we used a GAM cell for variable selection, which uses a lasso regression combined with a generalized additive model. And we used a multinomial GAM to generate predictions for each damage level, that low level versus uprooting versus trunk breakage. So the summary of the most influential variables that we came up with included 4 pine trees, that they were more vulnerable in wetter soils and in areas with deeper bedrock. We determined that hardwoods are more vulnerable in acidic dry soils. And for both pine and hardwood, they were more vulnerable in areas with higher soil erodibility factors. Increasing valley depth decreased the vulnerability for both pines and hardwoods, so lower lying areas were less vulnerable, and then higher average temperatures also increased vulnerability. And below is a citation for this paper if you wanted to look it up. So we also developed maps going out 10, 20, and 30 years, utilizing the probabilities that we came up with from the models. We looked at the probability of certain types of damage within 10, 20, and 30 years. So what we're looking at here is a 10-year probability of uprooting on the left versus trunk breakage on the right for pine stands in different areas of the Southeast. And then we have the 20 and 30-year probability, and you can see some hotspots starting to emerge. And that's really what we were kind of interested in, is where are the areas where we might need to focus the most in terms of managing for resilience to specific types of damage. You can see areas of the Mid-South, Mississippi through Alabama particularly stand out, as well as Arkansas and Oklahoma. And likewise, we did the same thing for hardwoods. So this is a 10-year probability of uprooting versus trunk breakage. This is 20-year probability. and 30-year. And again, we see some hotspots emerging, especially in Alabama and Arkansas. So next I want to move on to some of the work that I did at the stand scale. And for this, we were looking at Hurricane Michael. And so as everyone knows, Hurricane Michael hit in October 2018, did a lot of damage to commercial stands. We were able to collect data for over 900 commercial stands in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, where there was damage. And again, it did a similar process, collecting, the same kinds of terrain variables in these areas that were damaged, as well as soils. And since this was more stand scale, we were able to get finer resolution on soil data. And also we were able to collect stand characteristics and management history from the landowners. So things like tree height, spacing, basal area, thinning history of herbicide or fertilizer treatment. And we were able to look at those types of variables as well to see what might have been influencing the levels of damage in different stands. So the most important predictors that we found from this analysis were wind speed, obviously was the most important, but also tree density as measured by trees per acre, dominant tree height, and the linear distance to coast. Obviously, within about 50 kilometers of the coast is where we saw the most damage, or within 50 kilometers of the coast, soil wetness index, and the time since the last thinning. As most people are probably not surprised to hear, stands that were more recently thinned had greater levels of damage. So we see that trees per acre and tree dominant height were two predictor variables, but we also wanted to look at their interactions with other variables. So these are two-way interactions. On the left, we're looking at wind speed and trees per acre or stand density. And on the right, we're looking at wind speed and pine dominant height. So you see that wind speed obviously is the most important variable, and damage levels increase with increasing wind speed, but it's not consistent across all levels of trees per acre. That when we have less dense stands, there is greater vulnerability across the different, different levels of wind speed. And likewise for pine dominant height, we also see as wind speed increases, obviously damage increases, but it's not consistent across all height levels. We have kind of a hump there from about 45 to 65 feet is what we're seeing here in the yellow area that has the highest level of damage. So now I'm going to briefly touch on some of the work that's been going on at the community scale, looking at insect responses to severe wind damage. And for this, I'm going to highlight some work of some other folks out of UGA who looked in the same stands that I was looking at for Hurricane Michael. They were looking at beetle populations immediately after the hurricane. So Seth Spinner, who was a master's student at UGA and is now an entomologist at University of Kentucky, looked at bark beetles and root feeding weevils. And Chelsea Miller, who was a postdoc at UGA and who is now an assistant professor at Akron State University, looked at wood boring beetles. And so for this analysis, they looked at 3 different damage categories. The low damage category, which was where less than 20% of the trees were damaged. The moderate damage category was 20 to 40% tree damage, and high damage was greater than 40% tree damage, as you can see in these photos. So what they found, this is Chelsea Miller's work, who she looked at the wood boring beetles, was that there were higher numbers of total wood boring beetles in moderate and highly damaged stands. Especially for 2019, there was a significant increase in wood boring beetles in the moderately damaged stands. In 2020, they were unable to sample those, I believe, because there was some salvage operations in those stands, but we saw higher wood boring beetles in the highly damaged stands. So the implication here for wood borers, obviously what we're most concerned about is salvage timber. And so the implication here is that timely salvage of of moderate and high damage stands after a catastrophic wind disturbance can lower the economic impacts of these subcortical beetles. And then for bark beetles, what was interesting is there was no significant finding with regards to bark beetles. Looking at both southern pine beetle and Ips beetle, it was essentially the same in low, moderate, and high stands, or there was no statistical difference in their populations, and likewise for the root-feeding weevils, which isn't exactly what we expected to see, but what we realized was that it's likely because of the fact that Hurricane Michael was a late season hurricane, and phloem is an ephemeral resource that quickly degrades. So when you have a late season hurricane like Michael that hit in October, over the winter months, the phloem degrades, and then when the beetles emerge in spring and they're looking then for new sites to infest, they're not that interested in those sites that got hit in October because the phloem has degraded at that point. And so if we contrast that to an early season disturbance, it might look very different because the beetles would be emerging right at the time that the stand has been damaged and would likely infest at that point. So essentially, for future research, we need to really be able to compare early versus late season disturbances, which is always easier said than done because it depends on a disturbance happening at exactly the time we need it and getting access to the land in time and so forth, like and all of those sorts of things. So, but it's something that we want to do a little more deeper research on. We're also looking at, I have another project going on in North Carolina with some of the folks that I worked with at UGA. We're looking at invertebrate community response to tornadoes. There was a series of tornadoes that hit North Carolina in these commercial stands. And so we've been tracking beetles, the same groups of beetles, as well as bees and plant communities. We don't have a full data set yet, or we're still analyzing the data. So we'll stay tuned for the results of this one. And then also another project that I'm working on and trying to get some funding for, and several other folks on this call are involved in this project as well, is kind of combining this work as well as the work of some of the other folks that you're going to hear from later on this webinar to create an agent-based model where we're really able to look at both the drivers of damage as well as the drivers of recovery and create a tool that ideally landowners can utilize to help them understand what their level of risk is and where they might want to invest to develop resilience in their particular areas. So, you know, we can model until the cows come home, but we really want to have something that is useful for landowners. And so that's the direction that we're moving in with this effort. And with that, that's all I had. So thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Christine. So just a reminder that the questions will be answered at the end of the seminar. So we're gonna go over every presentation. So if we could follow when you ask question like Paul just did it, like you have the questions and then you have the name of the speaker, that'll be great. Well, now it's me. I'm going to present my recent research development on the timber supply under hurricanes. Let me just share my screen here. All right. All right. So this presentation is about a timber supply challenge in a wake of hurricanes. This one is part of the thesis from a PhD student, so Ian Sartorio, who is now working for RMS. So my name is Bruno Silva. I'm specialized in forest finance and economics at UGA. So, well, it's very typical to have a hurricanes in U.S. South, and unfortunately, the past weeks we had a big one crossing the state of Florida and Georgia, and ended up in North Carolina. So this is a very common phenomenon, and it tends to repeat over and over every year. Uh, Not surprisingly, the cities on the coast, the communities on the coast, are the ones with high risk of being affected with these hurricanes, and they are already recognized by FEMA as a national risk index. So all those regions, we more or less know that they will be subject to this type of impact sooner or later over the years. And we had in 2018 Hurricane Michael, which affected that exactly region where Christine did her studies as well. Then we had $25 billion in damage and $1 billion only in timber loss in Florida. So as soon as we have a hurricane, some forests, some stands will be highly affected, and this timber will become savage, which will change a little bit the dynamic of the timber supply. Here's, for instance, an example what will happen when we have a strong winds. The trees break. Some of this volume could be used, but some not. So this is the dynamic where it changes within a year when we have a strong hurricane. And we will have the same, not the same, but similar dynamics with Hurricane Helene in the past week, where we can already observe it, a few stands that were already damaged. This picture from the Georgia Forest Association, for instance. So it's more or less in the same area as Hurricane Michael, but now we are looking at different damage as well. So there will be affecting the timber supply, at least in the short term. One way to deal with these impacts would be to look at the salvage logging. So it's more or less we can use more or less between 10 and 35% of the volume that is damaged due to a hurricane, and the value it decreased a lot. It decreased more or less 50% of the initial value of this stand. So once we are hit, forest landowners is hit by a strong wind or a strong hurricane, automatically you have to use all this salvage because otherwise this timber will not be useful for anything else. And the objective of this study is to estimate the damage area and timber volume. This is one part of the chapter of my students, Ian Sartorio. And then identify the main goals and constraints of this timber supply in in an environment when we have a hit by a hurricane. Determine why there are priority sites for a salvage. Generated valuable information for landowners, timber consulting facilities, and of course policymakers for future actions. So here's our study area. So here's a Hurricane Michael. In red, we have the areas where we have a stronger winds, and then yellow is less strong, and green less strong as well. It hits Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. So all this area over here is the counties that will be in our timber supply model. We already published part of this research, which is under Ian Sartorio. So understanding hurricane effects on forest land, try to understand the land cover change and salvage logging. The big challenge here when working with this type of study is to indicate what really was a salvage logging, or what really was like just a harvest operation before the hurricane comes. So that was the goal of this study leading by Ian. And similarly to what Christine was mentioned, we did investigate it here, what drives the change in land use, and therefore what drives the change in the impact of a hurricane in forest land, and distance to So here's where we start to think, well, that's fine when you have a maximum wind speed affecting the land use change, which means that is being affected by a hurricane. But also there's this other aspect here, which is the distance to the nearest mill, when also incentivize the land use change. So the big question of this study was, well, what is really affect the land use change? Is the maximum wind or is the distance to the mill? And also the other variables that we did investigate it. So we use the percentage change in NDVI. So to have an idea when this change happens is becoming a little darker red. And then when there's a very darker red, we can indicate some land use change. We use all this information to estimate the damage in this area. Once we have the damage in this area, we can say, well, the initial reaction would be, we have all these strong winds coming. These strong winds coming hit the land. So now we have this surplus of timber. And surplus means, well, we have more timber in the market than anybody was expecting. When we have even more timber in the market, prices are going to go down. And eventually price is going to recover because trees are going to start to grow again as there's a process of replanting. So given that dynamic, we developed a supply chain model. So especially the spatial equilibrium timber supply sets, where you use all this information with the regional markets. When we have a mills location, we have the age class distribution of the forest. We have the DBH distribution, and then pulpwood and saw timber distribution, and we are estimated for the future. So in summarizing the model is pretty much minimizing a certain goals, and one of these goals is transportation costs. So how much would cost to transport a timber from market A, from a stand A to mill X? So based on that and previous structures of this forest, area constraints, inventory and harvest constraint, we build up a kind of a simulator simulating what would be the impact of a hurricane. We investigated the optimum harvested in a business as usual. So we projected all the timber supply dynamics 5 years from now, and then say, well, there was no hurricane under Michael. And then we impose a scenario where we have a post-disturbance environment, which is when we have a hurricane. So we use the southern U.S. So it's in the south of the U.S., Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. It's a 5 years planning horizon. So all damage area started at year 1. So when we run this projection, year 1 is when we have the damage in the inventory. We collected the data using remote sensing, and there's several levels of damage. And looking at our sample, a very good assumption would be when the level of damage is in this area, this very red area, dark red, this is when we have a damage. And we work with 15 counties at the beginning in the south, just to show you guys a little bit of the sample. And it's more or less 50,000 hectares of pine forest damage in this area. So here's an example of that. So we have all this forest that here's the volume. So the green areas is the volume. When you have a conversion, this volume is going to become available. So we have a supply of timber that there was not expecting. So okay, so here's our study area. We have different counties and different removals. So the timber demand we use as a proxy the removals at FIA, the Forest Inventory Analysis. So everything here, when it's a darker green, it means that it's being removing a lot. When it's a light, it's not removing as much. It doesn't mean that it's not removing. It just means that it's not removing as much. So here's what we consider the timber demand. So before and after hurricane, this timber demand is the same, which is a kind of expected, right? You want this, well, demands can change, but doesn't change much before and after a hurricane. Given that demand, we have a current inventory, and then we project this inventory for the next 5 years. So the graph that you're looking here now is the pulpwood inventory for business as usual. On the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, we have the hurricane. So the inventory, even without a hurricane, was reducing over time the next 5 years. With a hurricane, it's also reducing. Well, as you notice here, it's pretty difficult to see the difference. And for those who work with FIA or work with the timber supply models, you notice also that there is a huge inventory on the ground in the US South. So the difference here is going to be minor. And if you go to a percentage of this difference, we see, well, they are the same before the hurricane. And as the hurricane hits, we see that there is a reduction of the inventory, a faster reduction of the inventory when we are in a hurricane. In this this graph over here, the y-x, we have the ratio between business as usual and the hurricane scenario. So for instance, 0.97 means that the inventory when we have a hurricane is 3% lower than otherwise, than with a business as usual scenario. So there is a reduction in the inventory pretty quickly after the hurricane of more or less 3% or 3 to 4%. And now we can see that spatially. So we have a scenario after hurricane. Here is where the timber has been moved around in this area in year 1. And here's after the hurricane. So you could see the difference in the green colors here in certain counties. So when you have a very dark green is where it's being more harvested. So when you have a hurricane, there's a higher concentration of timber being harvested where the hurricane is hit. And this is because of the salvage, right? We have making more timber available in a short period of time. And not surprisingly, in terms of transportation costs, at year 1, we have a reduction in cost, in this case of more or less 37% in year 1. So it's cheaper to transport timber because now the area affected by the hurricane makes everything available for the mills located here. So they don't have to look at neighbors to get their supply of timber. But over time, we have an increase of 2% of this cost per year. So it becomes very cheap initially to harvest this timber, but then it becomes, due to the lack of inventory in a certain age class, this becomes more expensive. So some conclusions. Well, the Hurricane Helene for sure will cause some shocks in local market. With systematic increase on transportation costs, an initial reduction, but a systematic increase in the long term. But it's a very, very difficult to estimate the entire impact of this phenomenon with a large scale. What we have to do is kind of look at the final scale with data and stand, or even a tract level. And then we can simulate it more interaction between this agent, accounting for the capacity of harvesting, the local demand, and how the different mills they compete for the same resources, and how the interaction of these agents. And with that, I thank you. I thank you again for the Forest Service for this funding, and thank you very much, everyone here for your time. And again, the questions will be available at the end of the seminar. Okay, I turned my camera off. Well, and now the next presenter will be Adam Polico from the Mississippi State University.
Thanks, Bruno. Let me get my screen shared here. There we go. So, like Bruno said, my name's Adam Polenko. I'm an assistant professor of silviculture in the Department of Forestry at Mississippi State University. I'm going to talk about some of the work that some of my colleagues and I have been working on. Jim Goulden and John Willis of the Southern Research Station, and Ajay Sharma of now Auburn University, but we were working on this. He was at University of Florida. And just I guess when I was asked to present in this this panel, this was definitely an exciting opportunity. And as you might be able to tell, this is a culmination of a whole bunch of work that our group and many other people have been working on for quite a while, but we did not plan the timing to coincide with Helene as well as Milton, which is expected to hit Florida in the next couple of days. So thoughts go out to people affected by both Helene and Milton. And as scientists and researchers, I understand that we tend to be or come off as excited about hurricanes, but it's certainly with the intention that we can make some progress and help landowners on the ground. So I was excited to see we've got a whole range of people across the country. And so just a little bit of background on the South. In the South, we grow timber really fast, really quickly. And that's primarily through even-age silviculture. Clear cut, replant, that's where our efficiency comes from, right? We contribute significantly to domestic wood supply and global wood supply. We're really good at growing trees. Predominant paradigm, like I said, is even-age silviculture, and really just a handful of landowners practicing uneven-age silviculture. So that's things like group selection and single tree selection, where you come back every periodically and make entries into a stand throughout a stand's life cycle. Now, from the research side, uneven-age silviculture is hypothesized to be more resistant and resilient to disturbances, simply just because of diversity. You've got size class diversity because you're managing different age classes, and those different age classes may be less susceptible across that distribution to a particular disturbance. But as you've heard already today, that disturbances, in particular hurricanes, are really challenging to study because, well, from a silviculture perspective, trees take a long time to grow, and it's hard to study really anything from a silviculture's perspective. It's one of the advantages of being in this region is you can do lots of silviculture in a short amount of time, or at least relatively shorter. But in the terms of hurricanes, unless we went out and systematically installed permanent sample plots where we inventoried regularly and then just waited for a hurricane to hit, we're kind of stuck with this sampling bias of piggybacking onto existing data, and then trying to see what we can learn when a hurricane does hit a particular area. And in our case was Hurricane Ivan. Hurricane Ivan hit September 16th. This should be 2004. It made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane, and the eye wall just happened to pass 24 kilometers west of Escambia Experimental Forest, which is just right down here. So it's that red dot right there. Escambia Experimental Forest, it has a long history of being managed in conjunction with the Southern Research Station. And that means that there were all kinds of opportunities to ask questions about silviculture implemented on the ground, and how that interacts with hurricane disturbance. And so looking at what we had to deal with from Escambia, we set a couple objectives. First, let's try to answer that question of, are uneven age stands more resistant and resilient compared to even age management? And then we also had a range of stocking regulations, which I'll get into in just a second, that we could evaluate resistance and resilience as well, and then look at things like stand structure, like size class, and its interaction with hurricane disturbance. So we had, like I said, we had a number of uneven aged stocking regulation methods on Escambia. So like I mentioned, uneven age management, go into a stand and you're going to cut out a portion of that stand over multiple entries throughout a rotation. And there are all kinds of different ways to control the regulation of a stand. If you're remembering back to your undergraduate silviculture class, one of the characteristic distributions is that reverse J distribution. And that's sort of what we're targeting with these different regulation methods to some extent. And so the BDQ method is based on 3 parameters: residual basal area, maximum leaf tree diameter, and then the ratio of trees in successively smaller diameter classes. So that's the Q factor. And so we had a couple BDQ regulated stands, some looking like that characteristic reverse J distribution, some less so. What I really want to draw your attention to is the number of entries, because of logistical issues and management history, unfortunately, all of these stands did not start in regulation at the same time. And so we had 2 BDQ stands, one being entered twice and the other being entered only once at 10-year intervals. Next up, we had a diameter limit stocking method. That's not traditionally a uneven age regulation method, but it was installed to compare. And that's basically a diameter limit. You're going to cut everything above a maximum leaf tree diameter at a residual basal area. So getting close to that selection high grade method. And so only one entry in each of these stands for diameter limit, 1992 and 1996. So not a true uneven age stand, a 2-age stand, but still under that stocking regulation. The third stocking method we had was volume guiding diameter limit method based on 2 parameters. We're going to determine the periodic annual growth of saw timber in that stand and then cut everything above that leaf tree diameter. So a little bit different compared to diameter limit, where you're only cutting the annual increment that is accrued over your cutting cycle. And so this was our closest truly uneven age stand. So 78, 88, and 98, those were the entries. And then a second replicate was installed in 1996. So only one entry, 2 cohorts in that stand. So not a traditional uneven age stand, it's 2-age stand, but still in that stocking method. And then we took all of those stands. We found a handful of even age stands that we had inventory for. So we have 3 even age stands and compared those stands with our uneven age stands. So what we had, this being a experimental forest, was 100% stand inventory of diameter. For those of you who have ever marked an uneven aged regulation method, it's really, really hard to get right. And so this being experimental, there were full censuses of stands by diameter. So really good data set to look at. But the complicated thing is that those inventories happened at different time periods and didn't happen directly after the hurricane, which is often the case with trying to study hurricane effects. And so we've got a range pre and post Ivan, ranging from 2000 to 2004 pre-Ivan, and then 2005 to 2009 post-Ivan, and then a follow-up inventory in most of those stands several years later. And remember that Hurricane Ivan happened in 2004. So a range of inventories. That means we have growth to deal with on either side of that hurricane. And the way we did this was we modeled stands in FVS, the Forest Vegetation Simulator. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Forest Vegetation Simulator, it's a distance-independent individual tree growth and yield model that will project forest inventory. It's based on diameter. And so those diameter data that we had were really pretty seamlessly went into FVS. And so what we did was start the stands at their first inventory pre-Ivan, and then let's grow those stands to the post-Ivan inventory. And that gives us an idea of basal area increment without disturbance. That's our baseline. And then we looked at a couple metrics. We wanted to know how resistant those stands were to damage in terms of basal area. And so doing a couple backflips with diameter or basal area increment, we were able to calculate a baseline basal area increment and subtract that out so that we aligned all of those inventories to be closer to pre and then post. That gave us an estimate of percentage of basal area increment lost to Hurricane Ivan. And then the same thing, we wanted to look at the recovery after Hurricane Ivan. Because there, as you'll hear throughout this series of seminars, we don't have a lot of information as to susceptibility and damage in response to hurricanes, or at least we're trying to learn more about that. The even more interesting question to me is how do those stands respond after disturbance, especially in partially harvested stands? We also looked at change in diameter distributions because we had a really rich diameter distribution data set. We used Menning's departure index, which is sort of like a Gini index, if you're familiar with that, just to look at the change in magnitude of changes in diameter distributions. We did some resampling and bootstrapping to calculate some confidence intervals and test significance of those departures in comparison to random distributions. And we looked at the effect of stand structure on both those resistance and resilience metrics. So QMD, trees per acre, density, stand basal area. And then we looked at some metrics related to stand structural diversity. So the ratio of SDI to the additive SDI is an indicator of stand structural diversity, and also Shannon's H index, both calculated with stand basal area and stand density. And so just a summary of the stands. More or less, the take home with this is that our density and our basal areas were more or less, they were pretty comparable. And just to give a reference, 983 trees per hectare is about 400 trees per acre. 461 trees per hectare is about 200. So relatively low density compared to your traditional even age management. But again, this is longleaf pine, so a little bit of a different forest type and stand structure. This is comparing our predicted basal area compared to our measured basal area. So you can see that all of the stands lost basal area pre and post Ivan. This was helpful in calculating those metrics of resistance and resilience. But the bottom line is that we did a pretty good job of calculating basal area or predicting basal area as a baseline, how we would expect that to progress into the future compared to disturbed stands. And I'll go through these pretty quickly. These are the same diameter distributions, except now we've included the pre and post inventory. And so you can see that we did have some shifts in diameter distributions. We had in stand 65 on the left here, you can see that in 2007, we had a little bit more of those younger age classes. So that would be towards the tail end, a little bit more. So that diameter distribution shifted to the right, which is what we expect when stands grow, but in this case also respond to the hurricane. And notably, didn't have a lot of change in those upper diameter classes. All right. And so this is not only, you have to remember that this includes growth as well in response to that storm. And so you have less basal area initially, but those trees that are left behind are reoccupying that growing space. And more or less, we see this trend throughout our uneven age stands pre and post disturbance. Here's VG, CDL, and also our even age stands. Now, something I want to point out is that there is one stand in these even age stands that doesn't look like the other, and that's going to be important for future discussion, and that's stand 2. You'll notice the average diameter is much smaller in stand 2 compared to stand 1 and 3, which almost sort of have a bimodal diameter distribution with a whole lot more trees on that upper end. And so putting this all together, we didn't have a lot of stands to work with, but we had a pretty rich data set, pretty unique data set, and the story is that stands that contained larger trees were less resistant than stands with smaller trees. And this plays out as you would expect with the stand dynamics. The denser stands carry smaller trees, and those denser stands are more resistant. In other words, they lost less trees compared to less dense stands that had larger diameter trees. We also found along those same lines that structurally diverse stands were less resistant to damage. In other words, when we calculate that structural diversity, essentially that's saying how diverse structurally are your stands? And by definition, that metric is accounting for those larger trees and those smaller trees. And so when you have more structural diversity, you tend to lose more trees compared to less structurally diverse. But then the interesting effect, it was a little bit opposite for resilience. That's your recovery. So denser stands were less resilient to hurricane damage compared to less dense stands. More diverse stands structurally in terms of basal area were more resilient. So in other words, they recovered quicker compared to less diverse stands. And then same thing with the stand density index tracking basal area. Less dense stands were more resilient to hurricane damage compared to more dense stands. And so I told you to keep an eye on that stand 2. This is where that diameter distribution really played a big role. In fact, stand 2 really didn't lose a lot of trees, whereas stand 1 and stand 3 with that upper larger diameter trees, those stands were some of our least resistant. And so putting this all together, when you compare resistance and resilience by those metrics that we calculated, there's really no difference between uneven age and even age stands. It all comes down to the distinct stand structure within those methods. Larger diameter trees and the associated stand dynamics, so stand density, play a role in susceptibility, and that rolls down to structural diversity. And so this all comes back to Oliver and Larson's stand dynamics textbook, thinking about resistance to disturbance, where you've got maybe over time, you've got different magnitudes of disturbance, right? And as that stand develops, the resistance to those disturbances is changing. All right. So initially, you start off with high resistance. Those are your younger stands that are smaller diameter. And even by definition, they're more flexible and resistant, and thereby resilient to wind damage. But as that stand develops, the resistance is changing. And so a disturbance that may not have been as impactful earlier in that stand's life now becomes a stand replacing disturbance. And so bigger picture, essentially we're dealing with changing risk profiles as we move through time, not only in response to stand development, but also disturbance pattern. And so what this all comes down to is that the longer your rotation, the longer you're allowing those trees to get bigger, the more susceptible those trees are to disturbance, irrespective of silviculture regime. So whether you're practicing even age management and you get some incentive, maybe from a carbon program to delay harvest, that inherently increases the risk of damage in that stand. Or if you are a landowner that is interested in managing for wildlife habitat for hunting, maintaining those larger diameter classes also increases your disturbance risk. So with that, I know we're waiting for questions, but thank you to everybody who contributed to this work. This goes back many decades, and there's a plug for the paper. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Very interesting talk. I appreciate it. Well, now we're gonna have our last last speaker here. We have Robert Chastain. Robert is gonna cover a little bit of remote sensing and how to estimate it, the impact of hurricanes using this important tool. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bruno. I try to share my application here. So hopefully we're just sharing the screen for the talk. Can you all see this? Title slide?
Not yet.
Okay. Try that again then. Sharing anything?
No, Robert, have you clicked on the green share button and then picked the application to share?
I've got it now. There's just a number of steps involved. I haven't used Zoom in a couple of years, so I'm relearning it. Can you see anything now?
We do. You just need to put it in presentation mode.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm working.
No,
with
you're
my
fine.
mouse. Okay. Is that good?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, great. My name is Robert Chastain. I've been working for the past 15 years with the Geospatial Technology and Application Center in Salt Lake City. As a contractor, on-site contractor, Red Castle Resources is the company that's held the contracts there for a little while now. And I've been more recently, during the COVID year, we were given an interesting project from Renee Jacobs and the Southern Region 8 remote sensing coordinator to look at potential hurricane damage predictions, the potential of predicting hurricane damage even before we have remote sensing. So this is a remote sensor. This has been a little bit of a departure for me. I've had to learn a bit more about meteorology and various data sets associated with that, and modeling of forest damage. That's more predictive model. If we're able to predict and maybe possibly accurately enough depict the damage patterns on a landscape scale after a hurricane quickly, that was like the goal of the project, and I'll describe that work in detail here. and I do appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm just going to talk about how we developed this approach, this modeling approach. We call it trees dip. It's, you know, coming up with a clever acronym is always a good start to any modeling or any sort of like product that you want to become emergent enough people to be interested in. And that was that's where we ended up. The tree step is a modeling approach, and it really is describing an ensemble of a couple of modeling approaches. One's a mechanical empirical model. Gales is the generic name of that. Forest Gales is more specific implementation of this one that hasn't been used a heck of a lot in North America yet. When I was doing my sort of reading review of that model, a lot of that work has been in Europe so far and in Canada. But I think it's becoming more present and emergent in North America and the United States as well now. Just want to describe what we did in phase 1 and 2 of the work, where we looked at Hurricane Michael, which, you know, as awful as that storm was as far as human impact, it sure did give a lot of us an incident that was very informative with respect to, you know, forestry sort of research and application development. And so, as such, in 2020, that was the recent large-scale hurricane that we could have as a retrospective event to try to like gin up this modeling approach. And in phase 2, I looked at 7 additional hurricanes because after year 1, we said, well, we know how to do that, and we have a sample of n = 1. We need to see how this approach might work with other storms with different characteristics. I'll just talk about the lessons learned from that, and I'll show a few slides at the end from the recent application that we did in response to Hurricane Helene just last week, basically, about a week and a half ago now. The project need is really the Region 8 partners wanted application for to rapidly and consistently look at these large-scale storm events. We know how to do hurricanes because a Southern Research Forest Service Southern Research Station research meteorologist named Scott Goodrick had a really good, you know, rotational vortex wind model that we could apply, which is important. As you'll see in a minute, for mechanical models, we need to know what the wind forcing is to figure out the probabilities and likelihoods that trees are going to get knocked down by, you know, the force of the winds as they occur with different storms. So we're trying to like respond for emergency funding requests that states tend to have to do within a couple of days after an event. So the need is kind of some sort of information in their hands within 24 to 48 hours was our sort of goal with this, and we've been able to, you know, automate this well enough to where that's, you know, been an achievable goal so far with the storms that we respond to over the last couple of years. So I've said some of this already. The object is to respond quickly before we have remote sensing information with predictive models that are, you know, able to at least give us some sort of landscape scale, accurate enough depiction to get a first idea of patterns of damage on the landscape scale, basically. And we were going to produce these products at the scale of 1 to 3 kilometers initially. I kind of kept that language in. And in the end, our sort of data that we're comfortable with sharing with the public is about around 1 kilometer in scale. The data sets that go into this are 30-meter scale data. So we're able to come up with 30-meter, you know, spatial resolution scale products initially. And we aggregate that up for public consumption to about 1 kilometer. And some of our more research partner-oriented folks are able to look at this data at its native output scale of 30 meters, in fact. So let's look at the sort of beginnings of this. We need to, again, like model a wind field accurately. And we have 2 depictions of wind that we've ginned up, and a pixel by pixel prediction of the maximum winds, just shortened as wind max, as well as a summation of winds. So the wind maximum wind speed and duration and time in minutes. So this is kind of multiplicative product. And you can see with this right panel here that you can kind of see where the eye is. It's a little lower value because during that period of time, there was no winds. So it's doing what it's designed to do there, and depicting exactly where the eye passed over at landfall there. And these data are obtained by just harvesting the HERDAT2 data just tabular data where it's lat longitude and wind speed and barometric pressure. And we interpolate between those actual observations that are put into the table by a factor of 7 to get a continuous wind field, such as shown here. And from that, Forest Gales uses, it's basically an empirical mathematical model. It uses a lot of variables to figure out what the predicted level of damage would be. And that's really emergent variable here is a sort of an engineering factor. That's the modulus of rupture of the wood. So you've got to give it a tree species modulus of rupture. You've got to pick one you think is going to be relevant for where a storm hits landfall. We modified this in phase 2 to make it a little bit smarter than this, but initially we just basically took in one variable, one modulus of rupture. There's tree height in there from land fire as well. As a lot of the talks previous to mine have kind of underscored, tree height is a very, very important emergent variable parameter for any kind of modeling you might do related to wind effects on forest and patterns of damage seen. So that's kind of a look at how that pans out. You can see gaps in it where there are not forests or where you don't have data. Tree height especially, it's not going to be making any predictions. So that's like the first aspect of this, because we're like wanting to like use that all that research that went into making gales happen and put those variables together for a more mechanical prediction of tree damage. We wanted to kind of look at a lot of other variables that would be not readily applicable to such a mechanical model. And so we went into a random forest, went down the direction of looking at random forest modeling as a way to put a lot of variables in. It's a good way to kind of put the kitchen sink in there as far as like spatially explicit variables that you have that are landscape covering variables. And we gather soil moisture from NASA Sport product that's relative soil moisture from 0 to 2 meters. It's a very coarse resolution, those data, 3 kilometer for the CONUS. If we're looking at the Caribbean, they do have a 1 kilometer data set for that area. That kind of goes into southern to central Florida, down into Puerto Rico. And we've looked at hurricanes down there too, using that higher resolution data. But I wanted to put in everything that we could find. Jim Ellenwood's data set from a number of years ago, basal area, stand density index, canopy cover. We're getting actually that from NLCD though, the TCC product, which I believe is going to be almost very correlated with basal area and density. But we'll see in a moment which variables kind of floated to the top once we started to look at all these variables together. A bunch of elevation variables that took wind exposition, effective airflow heights. I gathered a variable soil firmness from the GSurgo data. That is a special calculation. It's a combination of soil depth and moisture, water holding capacity. That was suggested to me as a variable that folks can. I've got basically a program, a Python program that is able to calculate that from the GSurgo. The tree height is land fire. Precipitation, I gather, as a near real-time variable for the actual event. That's kind of an important dimension too. Soil moisture. I have to gather that the day the storm hits its land. I'll gather the data from the day before to kind of look at pre-existing soil moisture before the storm hits. So that and precipitation is hopefully going to give us a better idea of where we might have tree tippage, real saturation potential there. Again with the soil firmness, as opposed to the breakage, bowl breakage that is more is being predicted by the Gales model. And this needs to be trained, right? It's a supervised model, so we need some kind of training data. What I've been using as input is either the WinMax or WinSum forest scale output. So wanted to also mention that we wanted to try to evaluate these models the first year in against some kind of reference data. So this is where remote sensing data does come in. We're able to look at retrospective events and look at pre and post Sentinel or Landsat data. In this case, I'm not sure which one we had. Probably had Sentinel already because it was 2018. And looking at a couple of differences in greenness, normalized burn index, normalized different moisture index, so the couple that I evaluated. We also had a very lucky sort of timing with the collection of the JEDI data. It's spaceborne sampled LiDAR data. They collected in, I think, believe they collected like 2019, right after the year after the storm. So we were able to compare the land fire heights with the JEDI data. It's not apples to apples, but you can definitely see that path in there. It showed where trees became shorter. This is sort of the bright colors are where the trees are shorter. What we ended up using is a really emergent reference data set that was the NBR difference, and that's been kind of corroborated by a number of other remote sensing studies, that tends to be a pretty robust way to evaluate other modeling approaches, evaluate best observation we can get after a storm of patterns of damage from actual spaceborne observations. So with that, we were able to kind of make a comparison of different models, the 4 scales, both WinMax and WinSum outputs for Michael, and different versions of the random forest model, which is kind of like using Occam's razor to take out less emergent, less sort of important variables. We're running a variable importance evaluation along with these to kind of see what variables are being heavily leaned upon by the model to get the results, and just getting against the NBR references we use. And this column's kind of relevant. I just accidentally forwarded. And I'm highlighting in red sort of the most, the best sort of R-squareds I was getting with these. These aren't very high, but just using them for really comparative aspects. And from that information, just to kind of show you what the products are, a 30-meter result for this. We break this down. It's continuous for 4 scales and random forest. You get a continuous, output. But our goal with this project is to match the Southern Group of Foresters' definitions of light, moderate, severe, and catastrophic damage. So we have to predict where those might break out from the continuous data, make the best classification that we can of those continuous results to give them a product that is consumable and sort of digestible within their sort of structure of where they need to be thinking about damage classes. This is a look at our 900-meter generalized results, just 30 meters, a factor of 30 on generalization. So it's around a kilometer scaled results, again, with the categories there. And lessons learned there is like what we were seeing from Michael is that 4 scales tends to slightly overpredict what they call maybe a pessimistic model. And I've seen that in the literature, that can be a bit pessimistic, whereas random forest yields relatively conservative predictions in comparison to 4 scales. And so we figured out that we knew how to predict spatial patterns of tree risk with this singular, very windy hurricane event. It was a category 5 after all. And so what we wanted to do next was look at other storms with different characteristics to understand how this modeling approach might perform with other storms, because we have an n equals 1 at this point, and we picked a bunch of storms that were different than Michael. A couple of them are like more windy, but some of them are more windy and wet. Laura and Delta were serial events. We wanted to see if there was any way to sort of model that in a logical manner and in a practical manner for what we're trying to do here. I think Florence was probably our wettest and non-windy event, so we could get an idea between that sort of spectrum of types of storms, and managed to make an enhancement to the 4 scale modeling, which I'll describe in a minute, which is really useful. We were lucky to get that second year of funding for these geotask projects. They're very finite. It's something that we do every year. We solicit input for like someone who has a problem they want to try to get solved, and do a finite 1-year project to try to look into that. We were lucky to get a second year for this. That's really not common. There was enough interest in this though to where we were lucky enough to do that. I'm just drawing in where these storms went. Makes Louisiana look very busy, but we've got over here to the east Florence from a number of years ago was our wet storm, to kind of give us, I don't know, some sort of a bracketing idea of like how well this modeling approach might be deployed. For the second year, we were able to separate our modulus of rupture for different forest types. I'm using in this model now an LCD, your basic land cover classes of 41, 42, 43, the evergreen deciduous mixed, and plus class 90, the woody wetlands, which in for this Louisiana storm would most likely, I probably put in the modulus of rupture for water tupelo for that. In Florida, that might be a more oaky sort of forest, though. I'm trying to learn more about which vegetation maps might be the most informative as to what we expect to see in these generalized classes. And I've been kind of leaning on the FIA Big Map lately for a little bit more information on that, whether it's going to be more laurel oaky or sweet gum as it is in Florida, woody wetlands, or more oriented towards, cypress or water tupelo in other areas. But this is a big improvement upon just throwing one modulus of rupture at every type of forest. I think we've got way more robust results out of this improvement out of that. Did the same sort of evaluations with NBR and just kind of a look at how the different, random forest versus looks for Ida in this case. That was our most recent storm that we looked at in phase 2. And again, with the those comparisons coming up with for all these storms, okay, where do we do? Where our results look most robust, strongest with that R squared? And it's interesting from taking just a glance at this, a quick glance, that 4 scales looks like a very robust approach for predicting, against remote sensing data, predicting patterns of forest damage. And with random forest, it seems like the more parsimonious models might be a little bit stronger than throwing the entire kitchen sink at it. With that in mind, we do some just basic, what I just kind of said, but in text for if someone wants to go back and read this and look at it. We were having a more robust output also for hurricanes that were more high winds was a primary characteristic, Maria, Katrina, and Laura, and a little bit lower high R squares were the hurricanes that were not as windy but better events. And 4 scales seemed to be robust overall. 8 out of 14 times that was the highest result we got. Again, back to the looking at the variable importance for random forest models. Precipitation very typically was important. Elevation variables seemed important, and surprisingly, I thought I would get a better result out of soil wind firmness for some of these, and it might be perhaps just a limitation in the GSurgo data. It's not as complete and maybe not as well vetted in forested areas compared to agricultural areas, which should be expected. I wasn't getting a lot of extra information out of those basal area and some of the variables that relate to tree stand measurements. Again, it might be either out-of-date data that I was using or, just I kind of need to have something that's landscape scale. So sometimes the downside of that is your timeliness is not as good for some of those data. But what I gleaned out of this information is like, which variables were most important most often for all these models that I just ran. Looking at all of those, it's just kind of summed them up. How often was it showing up in these different models? And kind of from that, the lessons learned that were pretty important from year 2 is that I ended up paring down my independent variables that I'm using for random forest modelings during this early application phase that we're in now, down to tree height, canopy cover from TCC. Precipitation and soil moisture, the near real time variables I'm still collecting and using in my random forest models. And the elevation and airflow heights derived from elevation kind of made the cut as well. So those are going into my random forest models. So enough about the soup to nuts kind of like development of this. I'll close by showing some of our recent work, what we got for Hurricane Helene. We've never modeled a storm that's this big. It's like, I think 550 miles from landfall to where I stopped modeling it when it became just a tropical depression again in southern Kentucky. This depicts a very narrow range of where the wind strength was high enough to be in there. So the lowest wind speed in this, my cutoff is 30 miles per hour. We're just really trying to figure out areas that might have enough strength to break tree boles for this model after all. we all very well know that there's a lot of damage in the Appalachians beyond that. So it's not really depicting the moisture. The issues are related to the excess wetness that occurred during rainfall and pre-existing soil moisture that existed in the Appalachians. But it does depict, very well where the wind blew. And this is just our wind model again, and we're getting from that again a classification of undamaged, light, moderate, severe damage, catastrophic damage, 4 levels of damage beyond that, which is, obtaining this from the continuous data is a bit, I should probably zoom into the next. Here's an unclassified, hot colors to low green colors, or high to low continuous values in this. To get from this continuous data to a 4-class classification is a little bit of an art and a science. I'm starting out with a geometric interval classification, but then I'm adjusting manually, sort of trying to interpret what I'm saying and see if those values make sense with respect to the map that it produces, which is much like what happens, how the Forest Service does its fire mapping. At the end of the day, is you go to a 4-class classification of burn severity, and the analyst's knowledge and understanding of those data is pretty key in where those values land. You start out with a sort of rule of thumb classification, some numbering scheme to go from continuous 8-bit to 4 classes, and then look at it to see if that makes sense from the study area that you're mapping in a particular, in this case, storm, not a fire. But so I'm applying some of that methodology. We're definitely borrowing some of our analytical methodology from what's been going on for the last, well, it'll be 20 years next year that MTBS started. So it's a long history of that. To show you the variable importance plot bar chart for Hurricane Helene before I show you the random forest model output. Elevation, most important variable. Canopy cover, definitely up there. Precipitation, definitely high. So what you're going to see in the next slide, it kind of like reflects that. You're going to see landscape patterns of elevation difference. And really, I think this is really a depiction of where we have a high risk of tree tippage, a high risk of soil saturation. It's kind of carving out. You're seeing like the river drainages here pretty strongly. Just zooming into the highest impact area here in Florida and Georgia, where the winds were at its highest, and that's kind of driving the model to some extent. There's probably, as the bar chart would indicate, patterns of canopy cover that are present too. Some of that is intercorrelated. We tend to have pretty high canopy cover in our drainages, don't we? So I think that's kind of how to interpret this map. It's wider area outside of the wind zone that was depicted in the forest scales model. So it's kind of not as dependent upon that, but it is trained from that output from forest scales. So there is a little bit of circular logic involved here. Anyhow, that's all the slides I have. Really appreciate it again, y'all's time and attention today. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. It was very informative, a lot of details, and I appreciated you showing already your results for Helene. Definitely, I will keep in touch with you about this data and everything else. Okay, so now we have a few minutes for questions, and I will open here the Q&A. Before we start in this question, I just want to thank you, everybody. Thank you, Robert, from the NC State for organizing all this, the logistics in this meeting. And also, who really put this together was Sean Tanger from from the University of Arkansas. And unfortunately, he got a little bit sick today and couldn't lead here. But let's go for the questions. So I will follow the order that show up here. So the first one is for Christine. So what soil database did you use in your analysis?
For the tornado study, I used StatSco because that was a more landscape scale. And then for the hurricane study, I was able to get stand level soil taxonomic data. And from that, then we can determine, the typical soil pH, permeability, drainage class for those taxonomies. So that was a more fine scale.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, now for the next question. I think the next question is to Adam. So I'd like Adam. Can you also read what is there?
Yeah. So
I
I think the
lost some
question
time reading that. So yeah.
is related to larger scale landscape impacts of hurricanes and how that balances with uneven age management. And Kent, if you're on, feel free to jump in or type in the chat for some more clarification. But in terms of uneven age management, combining that with timber management schemes and the overall effect of hurricanes, I think it's really comes down to a matter of scale, right? And the same diversification of portfolio that balances risk at the landscape level from a larger landowner, like a larger company that has a larger land base, also applies from an uneven age standpoint to a small non-industrial private landowner managing an uneven age stand. And so if you're a big landowner that has lots of different diameter classes or age distributions in a regulated sense across your land base, then you can tolerate some of that risk and holding some of those rotations, even age rotations, longer. And the same would go for a non-industrial private landowner operating at the uneven age stand level.
Am I able to be heard? I wanted to add a little bit to Adam's answer as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, I couldn't tell if my it wouldn't let me turn my camera on. Yeah, I just wanted to add too, we looked at some longleaf pine after Hurricane Michael and looked at some of the stand level effects. And we found that some complementary findings, but some of it also showed that planting stands really densely can reduce impacts. When you have a nice uniform forest, there's less input for wind penetration and things like that, which is maybe nice for a lot of commercial forests, but in restoration context, we're looking at longleaf pine forests where that's not really something that's recommended for the ecological for ecological outcomes. You're more interested in having open structure and uneven age stands like Adam was describing. So one of the big benefits though of having open structure is frequent thinning and taper. So we found that trunk taper could really add a lot of wind resistance to those uneven age stands. And so one of the recommendations we made in a recent study that came out earlier this year was whenever you're managing, uneven age stands with a lot of open structure like that, you really have to focus on getting high taper in there, because that reduces the center of gravity of trees and makes them much more stable. And in addition to the things Adam mentioned, like having more resilience because you have younger, smaller individuals and things like that. So I just wanted to add that real quick to the answer.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate it, Jeff. All right. So the next one is any messages to the biochar community? Maximum climate related best use of a downed timber. Well, it depends of the size of the log, I guess. But bigger logs, if you want to maximize your forest value, you have to just go for lumbers and etc. if possible. Yeah, I would go into this direction. If not pulpwood, if not energy, or just let it on the ground if you cannot do anything. Anybody else want to jump into?
Well, in terms of that salvage market getting saturated, like any additional market capacity that could utilize some of the damaged stands is good.
All right. So now the last one, Christian Montes, is to Robert. Robert, I think you can read the question. So would you agree that elevation is a a kind of a proxy for routing depth, as it is so well associated, most linear with depth to water table, probably past a certain threshold, not so important. That's for you, Robert.
Yep. Let me read the question here.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess these are all pretty intercorrelated. So maybe that's why these become emergent variables, because they are kind of telling the same story. With respect to random forest modeling, I suppose maybe elevation is probably a better continuous variable that we have on entire continental scale too. And I did kind of notice gaps in the GSurgo data in places where I would have really wanted data in some forested areas. It's perhaps kind of glossing over and predicting a single soil type that's a safe guess in places where it hasn't been heavily sampled, like the Appalachian National Forest is maybe an example. Harder to sample in the wetter areas, I suppose. Sometimes you have to get there when it's dry enough. Does that answer the question? I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't know about the modeling approaches that we're doing. And I would want to probably add something. I probably should say during my talk is that we really lack the cal-val data. We just haven't really validated these outputs yet for these storms in a very, to get boots on the ground in a timely manner to kind of give us one-to-one answer on how close are we with our categorical model predictions, whether it's moderate, light, severe, catastrophic, is something that we're really lacking. I know Christine had a data set post Michael. Well, I might very well reach out and ask if there's a way to kind of match that up one-to-one to the maps I was producing for Michael when our retrospective study initially in year one of our study to develop this work, because we're really lacking that. And whenever we have an event, we're talking to the states, like, well, if you go out there, can we have GPS points where you're going out and doing observations and match that up to what you're seeing out there? Give us a categorical answer that matches our Southern State Foresters Forest 4 classification. Because at some point, it's the validation is going to help us calibrate our identification of going from the continuous data to that categorical map that we're making. We kind of need to know how well we're doing and calibrate that at this point. So thank you for the question. I kind of veered off of it for a while, but I wanted to put the plug in that we could really use help in that department for the cal-val aspect of this modeling.
All right. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time to answer further questions, but there will be a second seminar of this series on October 21st, the same time, the same place, a link online. So that's pretty easy. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, other presenters. Appreciate your time, your dedication to this presentation. I think everybody's a little bit more informed about the impact of hurricanes in our forest sector in the U.S. South. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Robert, from NC State again.